April 29th, 1945. The air over the German town of Remagen hung thick with the smell of smoke and wet earth. A light drizzle fell from a low, pale sky, turning the dirt roads into ribbons of mud. The war was dying, but it refused to die quietly. In the distance, the last echoes of artillery rolled across the Rhine like fading thunder, each explosion weaker than the last, as if the great machine of destruction was running out of breath. For 6 long years, the world had burned. Now, in these final days of April, the Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own lies, and its soldiers, once proud, now gaunt and broken, wandered through the ruins of a country that no longer existed. A column of German soldiers trudged slowly toward the west, their gray uniforms soaked and caked with mud. Their faces were hollow, eyes sunken deep from hunger and sleepless nights. Among them were veterans who had fought since Poland, boys barely 17 who had never known anything but war, and old men pressed into service when the army had run out of youth. They carried no rifles anymore, just white cloths tied to sticks, fluttering weakly in the wind. It was the only language left that everyone understood: surrender. The officer leading them, Oberleutnant Franz Becker, walked in silence at the front. He had once commanded a company of over 100 men. Now, barely 30, followed him. He had no orders anymore, no homeland to defend, no Führer to obey. The radio messages had stopped days ago. Rumors spread like infection. Hitler dead, Berlin surrounded, the Americans crossing the Rhine. Some said the Soviets were executing prisoners. Others whispered that the Americans shot SS men on sight. No one knew the truth. All Becker knew was that his men had to survive. They passed through a forest where the trees were charred and splintered from shell fire. The ground was littered with discarded helmets, torn letters, rusting weapons, and the bodies of horses long since dead. The once orderly roads of the Reich were now filled with refugees, women pushing carts, children crying, old men hobbling along with whatever they could carry. The soldiers and the civilians no longer looked different. Everyone was a ghost now, moving through the same nightmare. As the sun began to break weakly through the clouds, they saw movement ahead. American jeeps. The stars on their hoods glistened with rainwater. The Germans stopped, hearts pounding. Some instinctively raised their hands. Others dropped to their knees. Becker lifted his white cloth high and shouted in broken English, "Nicht schießen," no shooting. His voice cracked, echoing strangely in the empty valley. The Americans raised their rifles, but did not fire. A young soldier with freckles and a helmet, tilted too far back, stepped forward. He looked barely 20. "Keep your hands up," he shouted, his accent strange and hard. The Germans obeyed instantly. Their hearts raced, expecting the worst. Becker could hear his men whispering prayers under their breath. He thought of his wife in Cologne, whom he hadn't heard from in months, and for a moment he wondered if he would ever see her again. Then, after a long silence, the Americans lowered their rifles. The freckled soldier waved his hand and called out, "It's okay. Come on, line up over here." The Germans hesitated. This was not what they had expected. No shouting, no blows, no threats. The Americans looked calm, tired, maybe, but not cruel. One of them even smiled, a small, weary smile that looked more human than anything Becker had seen in years. As they approached the checkpoint, the Americans motioned for them to drop their remaining weapons and sit down on the ground. They obeyed. The freckled soldier, whose name tag read Walker J., walked among them, checking for hidden arms. When he reached Becker, he stopped. "You the officer?" he asked. Becker nodded slowly. Yes, I am, Oberleutnant, Franz Becker. Walker studied him for a moment, then offered something unexpected, a cigarette. Becker blinked, unsure if it was a test. When Walker gestured again, Becker took it. His hands trembled as he brought the match to the paper. The smoke filled his lungs, harsh but strangely comforting. It was the first cigarette he had tasted in months. Walker crouched beside him and spoke quietly. "You boys look like hell." Becker exhaled slowly, watching the smoke rise into the mist. "We are finished," he said simply. The American nodded. "Yeah, war's done." The words hit Becker like a physical blow. War's done. Could it really be over? He wanted to believe it, but couldn't. For so long, the war had been everything, every sunrise, every heartbeat, every reason to live. Without it, what was left? He looked around at his men, young, frightened faces, staring at the Americans like children seeing strangers for the first time. For the first time in years, he saw something in their eyes that looked almost like relief. Nearby, an American sergeant called out to his men, "Get them some water." Another GI rummaged through a supply crate and pulled out sea rations, cans of stew, hard biscuits, chocolate bars. The Germans watched in disbelief as the Americans handed them out. Private Karl Hoffman, who hadn't eaten in 2 days, tore open a chocolate bar with shaking hands. The sweetness made his eyes water. "It tastes like home," he whispered. Becker noticed one of his younger soldiers, Otto, staring at a can of beans, unsure if he was allowed to eat it. An American soldier smiled and mimed eating, nodding encouragingly. Otto grinned weakly, murmuring a soft "Danke." The kindness was disarming. Becker had spent years believing the enemy was monstrous. Every speech, every leaflet, every order from Berlin had painted the Americans as barbaric invaders. But these men, these boys from Kansas, Ohio, New York, looked just as weary, just as human as the Germans themselves. They weren't shouting or mocking. They were just doing their job, trying to end a war none of them had started. As the prisoners sat quietly, eating, the rain stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off the metal of helmets and rifles. For the first time, the valley was silent. No bombs, no screams, no engines, just wind and the soft murmur of men talking in 2 languages, both struggling to find words that meant peace. A group of American medics arrived next. They began checking wounds, applying bandages, offering morphine where needed. One of them, a tall man with dark hair, lifted the sleeve of a German soldier and frowned at the shrapnel wound beneath. "How long's it been like that?" he asked. 3 days, the soldier replied weakly. "Jesus," the medic muttered, and got to work cleaning it. The German winced, expecting roughness, but the touch was gentle. Walker moved among the prisoners again, asking if anyone needed medical help. Becker watched him carefully. There was no hatred in his face, just exhaustion, maybe pity. It felt unreal. For months, Becker's men had been shooting at men like him, and now here they were, drinking water from his canteen. One of the Americans called out, "Hey, Jim, you got another canteen?" Walker tossed his urn over, without hesitation. Becker took a sip, the cold water running down his throat like mercy itself. He could not stop himself from whispering, "Danke." Walker smiled faintly. "You're welcome." The hours passed slowly. The prisoners were searched, tagged, and loaded onto trucks. No one was beaten. No one was insulted. It was the strangest thing Becker had seen in the entire war. Defeat without humiliation. He thought of all the villages his unit had passed through in the east, The burned homes, the crying children. He thought of what his country had done, and what it had become. And now, sitting in the back of an American truck, he wondered if this strange kindness was what victory looked like. As the convoy rolled westward toward a temporary holding camp, Becca looked out the side and saw the countryside passing by, fields once green, now scarred by craters and tank tracks. The sky was clearing, blue breaking through the gray. He could see farmhouses standing untouched, American flags fluttering from windows where German ones once hung. The world was already changing. He heard one of his men whisper, "Do you think they'll let us go home?" Becker didn't answer. He didn't know, but deep down, a small, fragile hope began to stir. Maybe the Americans were not like the stories said. Maybe mercy still existed, even after 6 years of madness. As the trucks crossed the bridge over the Rhine, Becker turned to look back. Smoke rose from the east, his country burning behind him. Ahead lay the unknown, but also something that felt faintly like peace. He reached into his pocket and found the cigarette butt Walker had given him. He held it between his fingers, still warm, still smelling faintly of tobacco and humanity. For the first time in years, he closed his eyes and let himself breathe. The convoy kept moving west, the rumble of the engines mixing with the rustle of wind through the fields. In the fading light, the prisoners sat quietly, not speaking, each lost in his own thoughts. Becker thought of home, of his wife and the house on the Rhine that might no longer be standing. He thought of all the young faces he had commanded, some now buried in the mud, and he thought of the American who had handed him water and said, "War's done." The phrase echoed in his head again and again, a strange melody that didn't sound like defeat. It sounded like something else, something he hadn't heard in a long time, something that might, one day, be called forgiveness. Days later, after hours of riding in trucks that bounced and groaned over broken roads, the column of prisoners arrived at a camp on the outskirts of Lemberg. The journey had been long, silent, and heavy with uncertainty. No one spoke much. Every turn of the wheels brought them farther from the front and deeper into the custody of the Americans. Yet none could guess what awaited them. Some imagined interrogation, others punishment. The younger ones whispered about execution squads they had heard rumors of, while the older soldiers simply stared out at the countryside with hollow eyes, thinking of home. The camp came into view as the sun was sinking behind a line of poplar trees. Rows of barbed wire fences glinted in the fading light. Guard towers stood at intervals, manned by soldiers with rifles slung casually over their shoulders. But what struck the Germans first was not the threat of the towers, it was the order. The place looked clean, organized, almost peaceful. There were rows of canvas tents, neatly arranged, a large mess area, and even what looked like a field kitchen, sending up the comforting smell of stew. As the trucks came to a stop, the prisoners were told to disembark. They climbed down one by one, legs stiff from the ride. The Americans moved among them briskly, but without cruelty. "Form lines. Move it along," shouted a sergeant, his tone firm but not angry. Becker, now officially listed as prisoner number 184, watched as his men complied. He had seen prisoner camps before, ones built by his own army in occupied Europe. Those camps had been places of starvation, filth, and hopelessness. This one was different. They were led through a checkpoint where their names were recorded and their pockets searched. Watches, knives, and personal trinkets were taken for safekeeping. When one young soldier hesitated to surrender a locket containing a photo of his mother, the American guard gently assured him, "You'll get it back when you're processed." The German boy blinked in confusion, unsure whether to believe him. Inside the camp, Each prisoner was given a numbered tag and directed toward the tents. The ground was soft with mud, but straw mats had been laid out inside to keep it dry. There were even blankets, coarse but clean. The Americans had arranged everything with a precision that felt almost mechanical. Becker sat down heavily, feeling his body relax for the first time in weeks. Around him, the other men whispered quietly, testing the edges of this strange new reality. Not long after, an American corporal entered their tent, carrying a clipboard. "You will be given food soon," he said slowly, his accent thick but understandable. "Stay in your tents until called." His expression was neutral, his voice steady. Becker noticed how none of the guards shouted insults or struck anyone. They gave orders, yes, but there was an absence of hatred in their movements. It was business, not vengeance. An hour later, a whistle blew and a line formed near the field kitchen. The smell of stew grew stronger. Beans, meat, maybe even potatoes. The prisoners approached hesitantly. The cooks, Americans in rolled-up sleeves, ladled portions into tin bowls and handed them over with chunks of bread. Becker took his and stared down at it, steam curling upward. It had been weeks since he'd eaten something warm that wasn't scraped together from scavenged scraps. He found a spot near the fence and began to eat slowly, savoring every mouthful. Around him the men did the same, chewing in silence, some too hungry to speak, others too dazed to comprehend the moment. Private Hoffman muttered between bites, "They feed us like soldiers." He laughed weakly, and for a moment, the sound of laughter, small, fragile, passed through the camp. Later that night, rain began to fall again, drumming softly against the tents. Becker lay awake, listening to it. The rhythmic sound mingled with the distant hum of generators and the occasional bark of an American guard's order. He could hear one of his men, Otto, talking softly in the dark. "Do you think they really mean to keep us alive?" he whispered. Becker didn't answer immediately. He had no certainty to give. Yet as he lay there, staring at the canvas above him, he thought about the American who had handed him a cigarette and a canteen days earlier. He thought about the steady hands of the medics who had treated their wounds without hesitation. Slowly he began to believe that perhaps this was not a cruel trick. The following morning, the prisoners were woken by the sound of a bugle. The sun rose over the camp, painting the world in pale gold. Breakfast was served: coffee, bread, and something resembling oatmeal. A few men looked suspiciously at the cups of coffee, as if expecting poison, but when one of them took a sip and found it bitter yet real, others followed. Becker walked outside and saw American soldiers cleaning rifles, joking among themselves or writing letters home. They looked relaxed, ordinary, and impossibly young. Some waved or nodded politely at the Germans. The fence separated them physically, but not emotionally. Both sides looked like men who had simply run out of war. That afternoon, a group of German officers was summoned to a large tent. Inside, tables had been arranged with papers and typewriters. A major in the U.S. Army, tall and calm, sat behind a desk. "Gentlemen," he began, "you are prisoners of war under the protection of the United States Army. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will receive food, shelter, and medical attention. If you cooperate, you will be safe." Becker watched the faces of the men around him. Some showed disbelief, others relief. The major continued, explaining camp rules, work assignments, and procedures for correspondence. The words Geneva Convention sounded foreign, almost mythical. The Nazis had invoked it in speeches, but Becker had never seen it practiced. Yet here it seemed to live and breathe. When the meeting ended, The prisoners were given forms to write home. Becker sat at the crude wooden table with a pencil in his hand, staring at the blank page. For the first time since the war began, he could write to his wife without fear of censorship. He hesitated, unsure what to say. "I am alive," he finally wrote. "I am in American hands. They treat us fairly. Do not worry." That evening, the camp took on a strange calm. Some of the Americans had brought out a harmonica and began playing near the guard post. The melody drifted through the cool air, slow, almost mournful. Becker recognized the tune. It was an old folk song, one his mother used to hum while washing clothes by the river. The sound transported him home, if only for a few seconds. Later, after lights out, a murmur spread through the tents. One of the prisoners, a man named Wilhelm, had collapsed from exhaustion. The guards quickly called for a medic, who arrived within minutes. The American knelt beside Wilhelm, checked his pulse, and ordered 2 soldiers to bring water. "He's dehydrated," the medic said, shaking his head. "Get him into the infirmary." The Germans watched in stunned silence as the Americans carried their comrade away with care. By the next morning, Wilhelm was sitting up, pale but alive. "They gave me soup," he said softly, "and aspirin." For a long moment, no one spoke. What words could they find for a kindness that defied everything they had been taught? Over the next few days, life in the camp settled into a routine. The men were assigned tasks. Some cleaned tents, others helped repair vehicles or dig drainage ditches. The Americans paid them with extra bread or cigarettes. There were no beatings, no humiliation, only firm discipline. The guards enforced rules, but also shared jokes, sometimes even tossing baseballs across the open yard. In the afternoons, when the sun was high and the air smelled faintly of pine, Becker often stood near the fence, watching the world beyond. He saw local German villagers passing by, women carrying baskets, children walking barefoot. None dared approach, but some stared curiously. For them too, the war had ended differently than expected. One day, a guard named Walker, the same man who had first greeted Becker with a cigarette, came over holding a tattered German-English dictionary. "You can teach me?" he asked, awkwardly, pointing to a page. Becker nodded. Surprised, the 2 men sat on opposite sides of the fence, exchanging simple words. "Bread," Walker said, pointing. "Bread," Becker replied. "Friend," Walker said. Becker hesitated, then answered, "Freund." They both smiled. Soon others joined in. The younger Germans practiced English phrases, while the Americans learned German curses and greetings. Laughter began to replace fear. The camp, once silent and tense, now buzzed with strange conversations, fragments of 2 languages clumsily crossing barriers. In the evenings, when the guards made their rounds, they sometimes stopped to talk. Some told stories about their homes, cornfields in Iowa, the deserts of Arizona, the skyscrapers of New York. Becker listened with quiet fascination. These were not monsters, they were farm boys, mechanics, students, ordinary men who had been told, just like him, that they were fighting for freedom. A few days later, news reached the camp that Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was officially over. When the announcement was made through a loudspeaker, there was no cheering, only silence. The Germans stood motionless, absorbing the reality that their country, everything they had known, was gone. The Americans, too, looked somber. Victory didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, almost sorrowful. That night, Becker lay awake again, listening to the faint hum of insects and the low murmurs of conversation around him. He thought about the years spent fighting in mud and blood, about the men who had died for nothing, and he thought about the American soldiers who now guarded them, who offered food instead of bullets. Perhaps this, he realized, was what civilization looked like after madness. The days continued to pass, each one softer than the last. The guards grew less watchful, the fences less menacing. A few times, the Americans even allowed the prisoners to play soccer in the yard. Someone found an old ball, patched and scarred, and for an hour, men who had once tried to kill each other ran and laughed under the same sky. On Sundays, a chaplain came to hold services. He spoke about forgiveness, about rebuilding. The prisoners listened quietly, some nodding, others staring at the ground. When the sermon ended, an American soldier began to sing a hymn. To Becca's surprise, several Germans joined in, recognizing the tune from their own churches, different languages, same melody. By the end of that week, the camp no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a strange kind of waiting room between two worlds, the war behind them and something new ahead. The Americans treated their captives not as enemies, but as men who had been caught in the same storm. And for the Germans, that realization was more shocking than any weapon they had ever faced. Becca sat one evening near the fence, watching the sunset paint the clouds red and gold. In the distance, he could hear Walker laughing with another guard. The air smelled of stew again, and from somewhere near the kitchen came the faint sound of that same harmonica tune. Slow and wistful, the war was over, yet its echoes lingered in every face, every breath, every cautious act of kindness that began to bridge what had once seemed impossible. By early May, the air inside the Limburg camp had changed. The cold winds of April were gone, and the trees outside the fences began to bloom with cautious green. The war that had devoured everything was ending. Piece by piece, across Europe, one by one, the German prisoners began to realize that the thunder of artillery in the distance had stopped for good. There were no more planes overhead, no more bombings, no orders shouted through the night, only the sound of birds, the steady hum of American generators, and the unfamiliar rhythm of peace. The prisoners spent their mornings working in small groups under American supervision, repairing tents, digging drainage ditches, carrying supplies. The tasks were repetitive, but strangely comforting. Each swing of the shovel, each wheelbarrow of dirt, was a reminder that their lives still had value. Becker found himself leading a work team again, but this time not as an officer, giving orders. The Americans treated him as a foreman, trusting him to keep the men organized. It was work, not war. It was purpose, not power. Letters began arriving by the second week of May. Mailbags were delivered in canvas sacks, guarded like treasure. The first time Becker heard his name called, he stood frozen, hardly believing it. The guard handed him an envelope, the handwriting instantly recognizable. His wife Anna. The paper was thin and worn, written weeks earlier, but her words felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. She was alive. Their home in Cologne had been damaged, but she and their young son had survived by moving in with relatives. "I pray that you are safe," she wrote. "If you are alive and can read this, then that is enough for me." Becker read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it inside his shirt. He sat under the tent flap for a long time afterward, staring at the dirt. His throat ached, but he could not cry. Around him, other men were opening their letters, their expressions shifting between joy, disbelief, and heartbreak. Some had received news that their homes no longer existed. Some learned that wives and children were missing. One man sat motionless for hours after reading his, the paper trembling in his hands. Every afternoon, The Americans distributed stationery and pencils, allowing the prisoners to write back. Becker wrote for hours, describing the camp, the food, the guards. He told Anna that the Americans were kind, that he was being treated well, and that he believed he would return home soon. He left out the parts about the nightmares, the guilt, and the faces that still haunted him. He didn't want her to know how much of him the war had already taken. One evening, Becker and several prisoners were assigned to help unload medical supplies. Among the crates was a bundle of mail for the American troops. Walker, the young soldier who had become a familiar presence in the camp, sat on a crate and began sorting through the envelopes. One letter slipped from his hands, falling to the dirt near Becker's feet. Becker picked it up automatically and glanced at the writing. The name on the envelope was Mrs. Margaret Walker. Walker smiled faintly. "That's my mother," he said, taking it back. He tore it open eagerly, scanning the pages, his expression softening. Becker watched silently, reminded of his own wife's letter. For a brief moment, the line between prisoner and guard blurred. They were just two men far from home, clinging to words from the people they loved. In the days that followed, the camp grew more relaxed. The guards and prisoners spoke more freely. Some of the Americans began to trade small things: soap for cigarettes, chocolate for handmade trinkets carved from wood. The Germans who knew English acted as interpreters, helping translate orders and announcements. Becker often found himself mediating between both sides, a quiet bridge of understanding in a place built on mistrust. One afternoon, as Becker was returning from the mess tent, a guard called him over. It was Sergeant Miller, one of the older Americans. "You Becker?" he asked. Becker nodded. Miller handed him a folded sheet of paper. "This came for you," he said simply. The envelope was different, thicker, official-looking, with an American military stamp. Becker frowned, confused, and opened it carefully. The letter was written in careful, steady handwriting. It was in English, but he understood most of it. It was from a woman named Helen Anderson, from Illinois. Her husband had been a U.S. soldier, killed in Normandy. She wrote that she had learned from Red Cross records that her husband's unit had captured German troops near where Becker's division had once been stationed. "I do not know if you were among them," she wrote, "but I wanted you to know that I do not hate you. My husband believed that someday, after the war, we would all learn to live as people again. I hope he was right." Becker read the letter twice, then a third time, feeling something tighten in his chest. The words were not angry. They were not filled with bitterness. They were human. That night, he showed the letter to a few of his men. One of them, Hoffman, looked stunned. "An American woman wrote to you?" he asked. "Why?" Becker didn't answer right away. "Because she lost someone," he said finally, "and she chose not to hate." In the following days, Becker carried that letter in his pocket everywhere he went. He would take it out in the quiet hours of dawn, when the camp was still asleep, and read it again. It became a strange kind of compass for him, proof that compassion could exist, even between enemies. The Americans continued to treat the prisoners with dignity. Medical care improved. The infirmary expanded. A few prisoners volunteered to help the doctors, including one who had studied medicine before the war. They worked side by side with American medics, treating both prisoners and guards. The smell of antiseptic replaced the stench of blood and decay that had haunted so many battlefields. On one particularly hot afternoon, an American chaplain came to the camp to hold a service. He spoke about peace, about loss, about rebuilding. His words were translated into German by one of the interpreters, and though the prisoners were hesitant at first, they listened. Some bowed their heads, some wept quietly. Afterward, the chaplain stayed to speak with them one by one. Becker waited his turn. When his homon came, he said simply, "I do not know if God forgives us." The chaplain looked at him kindly and replied, "Maybe that's why you're still alive, to learn how to." That night, Becker couldn't sleep. He walked to the edge of the camp where the fences met the tree line. The moonlight turned the barbed wire silver. From the guard tower, a soldier's voice drifted down softly as he hummed a tune. Something slow and sad, yet beautiful. Becker stood there for a long time, breathing in the cool night air. It felt like standing between two worlds, the one that had ended in fire and the one that was struggling to begin. By mid-May, news of the war's end had spread through the camp. The prisoners gathered around the loudspeaker when the announcement came. Germany had officially surrendered. There was no cheering, no celebration, only stunned silence. Some men sank to their knees, others looked at the ground, unsure how to feel. Becker closed his eyes. The words "unconditional surrender" echoed in his mind like a tolling bell. In the days that followed, the camp became quieter, without the looming shadow of war. The tension slowly drained away. The Americans seemed more relaxed too. Guards laughed more, joked more. The prisoners were allowed to write longer letters home, and some were even permitted to walk outside the main compound under escort. Life in small ways was beginning again. One evening, as Becker was helping distribute supplies, he noticed Walker sitting alone near the mess hall. The young soldier looked different, tired, distant. Becker approached cautiously. "You look troubled," he said in careful English. Walker glanced up and gave a tired smile. "Got a letter," he said, "from my mother." "Bad news?" Walker hesitated. "She said my brother was killed in the Pacific, Okinawa." He looked away, swallowing hard. "She said I'm the only one left now." Becker didn't know what to say. He thought of his own brother, who had died on the Eastern Front. After a long pause, he said quietly, "My brother too, Russia. He never came back." The two men sat in silence for a while. No words could bridge that kind of pain. But the silence between them wasn't empty. It was shared. When Becker finally spoke again, it was barely a whisper. "Your brother died far from home. Mine too. Maybe they would have liked to know that we are not enemies anymore." Walker nodded, eyes fixed on the ground. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe they would." After that night, the two spoke often. Walker practiced German with Becker, and Becker taught him phrases and idioms. They traded stories about farming, about snow, about mothers who worried too much, and children who grew up too fast. For both of them, it became a quiet friendship, built on small words and long silences. The war had stripped away everything: ideology, uniforms, pride. What remained was just humanity, raw and fragile. Becker saw it every day now, in the way an American guard shared cigarettes with a German boy, in the way prisoners helped each other write letters for those who couldn't read, in the way both sides began to see faces instead of enemies. One afternoon, Becker received another letter from Anna. Her tone had changed, lighter, more hopeful. She had found work helping rebuild a school. "They say the Americans have come to our city too," she wrote. "They give food to children. Perhaps they are not as cruel as we were told." Becker smiled as he read it. His wife was learning what he had already seen firsthand. The world was healing slowly, painfully, but it was healing. He folded the letter carefully, placing it alongside Helen Anderson's in his pocket. Both letters, the one from his wife and the one from the widow of an American soldier, had become symbols of something larger than himself. Between them lay the truth that had taken him 6 years of war to understand, that compassion could survive even in the ruins of hatred, that mercy could outlast any flag or uniform. The days grew longer. The camp became quieter still. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the bark of orders. The prisoners built benches, repaired fences, planted small gardens near their tents. The Americans began to smile more when they walked by. Sometimes in the evenings, Becker could hear laughter drifting from the guardhouse, music from a radio, voices singing softly in English. He didn't know the words, but the melody made him close his eyes and listen. Some of the men in Becker's tent began to talk about what they would do when they were released. One wanted to return to his farm. Another dreamed of studying architecture. Becker listened without speaking, knowing that when his turn came, he would have to face a Germany he no longer recognized. Yet for the first time, the thought of rebuilding did not fill him with dread. It felt like a chance, one he did not deserve, but would not waste. The Americans kept their word. They treated the prisoners humanely, fed them, clothed them, and never once sought revenge. The men began to realize that their captors were not their enemies anymore. They were the first proof that mercy could exist after war, and that realization began to change everything inside them. By September of 1945, the leaves around the Limburg camp had begun to turn golden. The air smelled of soil and rain again, but it was a gentler season this time. Not the harsh mud and smoke of April, but something softer, something that promised life. The war had been over for months, though the memory of it still clung to every man like dust that would never quite wash off. The prisoners knew that their time in the camp was drawing to an end. Rumors spread each day. Trucks were coming. Lists were being prepared. Some had already been transferred to other zones for release. Nobody knew when their turn would come, but everyone felt it approaching. The camp looked different now. The fences were still there, but their meaning had changed. The guards no longer shouted. The prisoners no longer flinched. Work details had been reduced to light chores, tending the vegetable plots, repairing fences, cleaning the storage huts. Becker spent his mornings helping in the administrative tent, writing names, translating forms and keeping track of supplies. The Americans trusted him completely now. He had become, in an unspoken way, part of the machinery that kept peace running smoothly. Every day at noon, the camp bell rang for lunch, and men gathered in groups beneath the late summer sun. The conversations were no longer whispers of fear or bitterness. They were about home, about rebuilding, about what the world might look like after all this. Some men talked about going back to farming. Others dreamed of finding their families. Becker listened quietly, offering few words. When asked what he would do, he always said the same thing: "I will go home, and I will start again." The Americans had grown familiar too. Walker had become something of a friend to many of the prisoners. He would walk among them without his rifle, chatting freely, sometimes sitting on an overturned crate sharing stories about his home in Kansas. Becker often joined him. They would talk about crops, about how the rain smelled before harvest, about how different the sky looked when there was no fear of planes overhead. These were small things, ordinary things, but they were what life was made of. One morning, a Red Cross truck arrived at the camp gates. A group of volunteers in crisp uniforms began unloading boxes, marked with the emblem of the organization. Inside were clothes, soap, letters and food parcels, some even from Germany. The news spread quickly. Prisoners gathered in long lines as names were called. Becker received a small package, wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a bar of soap, a tin of sardines, and a short letter from a relief worker in Switzerland. It wasn't from Anna, but it still felt like a piece of the world reaching out to remind him he existed. That evening, Becker sat near the fence, cleaning his hands with the new soap, watching the sunset through the barbed wire. Walker came by carrying a tray with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Becker and sat down beside him on the grass. They drank quietly, listening to the sound of crickets. "Your people will go home soon," Walker said. "Maybe next week." Becker nodded, slowly. "It feels strange," he replied. "After so long behind fences, I almost forgot what freedom feels like." Walker looked at the wire, then at the horizon. "Freedom," he said softly. "It's not always what people think it is. Sometimes it's just being able to sleep without fear." Becker smiled faintly. "Then maybe we are both learning what it means." As darkness fell, the guards lit lamps along the perimeter. Their light was soft, golden, flickering in the night air. The camp was quiet, except for the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of engines from the American convoy routes beyond. For the first time, Becker felt something close to peace. The next few days passed quickly. The camp commander announced that a large group of prisoners would be repatriated to Germany within the week. The announcement spread through the camp like wind through grass. Some men cheered, others stood silently, too overwhelmed to react. Becker felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Home, what was home now? The country he had fought for no longer existed. The cities were in ruins, the flags had changed, the leaders were gone, and the guilt of everything they had done hung over them like a shadow that could not be escaped. That night, Becker couldn't sleep. He walked quietly past the tents until he reached the fence near the guard post. Walker was there again, leaning against the tower rail, smoking. When he saw Becker, he grinned. "Can't sleep either." Becker shook his head. "Too much noise in my mind. I know that feeling," Walker said, flicking the cigarette away. "I had it too when I came back from the front. Still have it some nights." They stood together, the silence between them. Comfortable, finally. Becker spoke. "When I came here, I thought you would hate us. I thought you would make us suffer for what we did." Walker didn't answer right away. He looked up at the stars. "Maybe some men did hate you," he said. "But hate doesn't fix anything. My father used to say, if you keep feeding hate, it eats you faster than the enemy ever could." Becker nodded slowly. "In the war, we forgot that." "Everyone did," Walker replied quietly. The following morning, trucks arrived at the camp gates. Soldiers began calling names. Becker's was among them. He packed what little he had, his letters, a worn jacket, a pocket knife, and a folded scrap of paper where he had copied a line from Helen Anderson's letter. "We must learn to live as people again." It had become his compass, his promise to himself. The prisoners lined up beside the trucks, ready to leave. The Americans handed each man a parcel, food for the journey, cigarettes, and sometimes an extra blanket. There were handshakes, nods, even laughter. Some of the prisoners thanked their guards in broken English. Others simply saluted. When Becker stepped forward, Walker was there. He extended his hand. "Good luck, Franz," he said. "Don't come back as a soldier next time." Becker clasped his hand firmly. "I will come back as a man," he replied. For a long moment, they stood like that. Two soldiers from opposite sides of a war that had tried to erase their humanity. Then Becker climbed onto the truck. The engine roared to life, kicking up dust as the convoy began to move. As they drove away, Becker turned in his seat and looked back. The camp grew smaller in the distance, the fences, the tents, the watchtowers fading into the golden light of morning. He could see the figures of the American guards standing by the gates, some waving, some simply watching. The sight of them did not feel like imprisonment anymore. It felt like farewell between people who had shared something no one else could understand. The trucks rumbled westward through the countryside. The roads were lined with the wreckage of war, burned-out tanks, shattered bridges, homes reduced to stone skeletons. But between the ruins, green shoots of life were returning. Farmers were back in their fields, children walking barefoot along the ditches, women hanging clothes to dry in the wind. The war had destroyed everything, yet somehow life had refused to die. After several hours, the convoy stopped near a small village where Red Cross officers checked the lists again. The prisoners were given water and bread while the paperwork was processed. Becker stood near the well, looking at the church steeple that still stood amid the rubble. Its bell was cracked, but it still caught the sunlight. He thought of how many bells across Europe had fallen silent during the war, and how, perhaps one day they would ring again. When their documents were stamped, they were told they would be sent to the Rhine, crossing the next morning, and from there return to German civilian authorities. The men gathered around campfires that night, sharing their last rations, speaking in low voices about the future. Becker sat apart, staring into the flames. Across from him, Hoffman was sketching something in the dirt, a small house, a tree, a river. "I'm going to build this again," Hoffman said. "My father's house. Maybe the war took everything, but I can still build." Becker nodded. It was a small dream, but it was enough. At dawn, the trucks moved again. The mist lay thick over the fields as they approached the river. The bridge had been rebuilt hastily, with planks and steel girders. On the far side stood German officers, under Allied supervision, ready to register the returning prisoners. When the trucks stopped, the men climbed down one by one. Some kissed the ground. Others stood in silence. Becker remained still, looking across the river at the land he once called home. Walker appeared beside the convoy, having come to see them off. He waved when he saw Becker, and Becker lifted his hand in return. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The river glimmered between them, carrying away the reflections of two soldiers who had met as enemies and parted as something far better. When it was his turn, Becker stepped forward. The American officer checked his papers, stamped them, and handed them back. "You're free to go," the officer said simply. Becker hesitated for a moment, then nodded and crossed the bridge. The boards creaked under his boots, the sound sharp and final. Halfway across, he stopped and looked back. The Americans stood at the far end, watching silently. The wind carried the faint rustle of the flag over the camp, the stars and stripes fluttering against the morning light. Becker raised his hand, not in salute, but in gratitude, and then turned away. The road beyond the river led through fields dotted with ruins and wildflowers. He walked for miles, passing small groups of returning soldiers and refugees. Some wore tattered uniforms like his. Others carried all they earned in sacks. Every face he passed carried the same question: what comes next? There were no answers yet, only the sound of footsteps and the promise of rebuilding. By evening, he reached the outskirts of a village. Smoke rose from chimneys again, and he could hear the sound of hammers and voices rebuilding walls. He followed the path toward the center of town, where an old woman sat outside her house, mending a shirt. She looked up and saw him, a stranger, a soldier, a survivor. Without a word, she stood, went inside, and returned with a cup of water. Becker took it, nodding his thanks. It was a small gesture, simple, human. That night, he found shelter in the remains of a barn. The air smelled of hay and dust, and through a hole in the roof, he could see the stars. He took out his letters, Anna's, Helen Anderson's, and read them once more. Then he folded them carefully and placed them back in his coat. He didn't know where Anna was now, or whether his home still stood, but he knew what he had to do. The next morning, Becker began walking again. The road stretched ahead, winding through a countryside that was scarred but alive. He passed fields where farmers were already plowing new soil, their hands rough but steady. Children played near wells, laughing, their voices carrying in the wind. For a moment, it almost felt like the world had been reborn. Far behind him, across the river and beyond the camp, America was just a distant name again. But its soldiers, their kindness, their restraint, their humanity remained with him. In a war built on hate, they had shown him the strength of compassion. It was a lesson carved deeper than any wound. He walked on, the weight of the war still on his shoulders, but lighter now, as if shared by unseen hands. In his pocket, the letters rustled softly. With each step, the path home was long, uncertain, but he kept walking, the words echoing in his mind. With every mile, we must learn to live as people again.